The lamps came up the quay 2 hours past midnight, and they were not fishermen's lamps. A fisherman's lamp swings with his stride and stops at his own slip. These four came slow and level and spread wide apart, the way men spread when they are sweeping for something small enough to hide. I had been smoking fish on Stonal Quay for 40 years, and I knew every sound the water could make against my slipway in a half-gale. The sound coming from under my overturned dory was none of them. It was breathing, quick and shallow, taken in little ration sips and held, the breathing of something that had learned that breath itself could betray it. I set down the rack I was carrying and shuttered my lamp. The four lights were 3 slips off, poking through barracks net shed, and the voices under them were flat and off-world. I crouched, my knees telling me everything they always tell me, and lifted the dory's gunwale an inch off the stones. 2 eyes looked back at me. They were too large for the face that held them, and as my shadow crossed them, a second lid slid sideways over each one, clear as harbor glass, the way no eye born on Harith closes, a child. Gray-green skin gone pale at the folds and crusted white where the salt had dried out of it, soaked through, jammed up under the thwart with her knees against her chest. One small hand lay spread flat against the hull above her head, and between the fingers ran webbing, torn once at a notch and healed crooked. I have heard men say that in moments like that one they weighed things. I weighed nothing. The lamps were 2 slips away, and there is no arithmetic worth doing between a child and 4 men hunting one in the dark. I opened the gunwale wider and put out my hand, palm up, the way you do for a dog that has been kicked by somebody wearing your kind of boots. She did not take it. She looked at the hand and then at my face and then past me at the lights, and I watched her do her own arithmetic faster than I have ever seen it done. Then she came out from under the dory low and quick, and when I turned and walked to the smokehouse door, she was already inside it, standing in the dark between my drying racks like one more shadow that smelled faintly of the sea. The brine cellar under my floor is 4 feet of stone and a trapdoor with a work table over it. I had her down it with a dry sack around her shoulders maybe 90 seconds before the knock came. The knock was polite. That was the first thing I learned about them. Men doing lawful work knock loud. Men doing the other kind knock politely, because politeness is the cheapest disguise there is. There were 2 of them at my door, and 2 more standing where they could watch my windows, and the one in front held his lamp up so it lit my face and not his. Heavy-set dryland clothes, a coat too good for the weather it was failing to keep out. Behind him a younger one, narrow, with a long jaw and a sailor's squint he had not earned. The heavy one showed me a square of card with a seal stamped into it. Claim runner's license, compact issue. The name on it was Dolch. He said they were assisting an agent of record in a restitution matter. He said an unaccompanied minor of the Vale species had come ashore along this coast, female, undocumented, and that under the Compact Restitution Act she was bonded, which meant money waiting on her safe recovery. And did I understand what safe recovery meant? He said it the way you say words you have worn smooth. Then he held up a second card, and that one had her face on it. It was not a good likeness. It was a registry capture, flat lit, a small gray-green face with the second lids half drawn, and an alphanumeric where her name should have stood, and under that a figure in compact standards with enough zeros on it to buy my smokehouse, my dory, and every man on this quay a new set of teeth. I looked at the card the way an old man looks at fine print, which is to say long enough to be believed. The smoke in my shed was doing its work on their eyes. The narrow one, redzo by the patch on his coat, was already blinking and leaning back toward the clean air. I told Dolch I smoked fish. I told him the tide caves south of Hag's Teeth were where anything washed up alive on this coast went to ground because the heat vents kept them warm, and that anything cold and wet with sense in its head would be there and not on a working quay full of dogs and lamps. I told it slow, with the seasoned patience of a man who has told strangers about local water all his life, and I watched him decide I was furniture. He left me the card with her face on it. Keep your eyes open, he said. Finder's share is 6,000. An old man could shut a smokehouse down on 6,000 and sit warm. I said that was true and good night, and I stood in my doorway with the card in my hand and watched the 4 lamps go away south, bobbing and spreading until the rain folded over them. Then I went inside, barred the door, moved the work table, and opened the trapdoor to the brine cellar. She had not been idle. She had found the lowest shelf and gotten herself onto it with her back against the stone and a brine scoop in one hand, held the way you hold a thing you intend to swing. When the light fell on her, she did not flinch from it. She watched me, and the scoop stayed where it was. And I understood that whatever this child had come through, it had taught her the difference between hiding and being cornered, and she did not mean to be cornered twice. I left the trapdoor open and walked away from it. That is the whole trick, and it took me 68 years to learn it, and one look at her to remember I knew. You do not coax a wild thing. You make the world quiet and you turn your back on it and you let it decide. I built up the firebox. I set a pan of seawater on the iron to warm because her skin had gone the color of old rope where it dried, and something in me said the sea was not her enemy but the dry air was. I split a smoked silverfin onto a board. No bread with it, no grain, just the fish and a strip of pickled kelp, and I put the board on the floor in arm's reach from the trapdoor. Then I sat on my stool under the lamp with a torn net across my knees and I mended it, and I did not look at the trapdoor at all. It took the better part of an hour. I heard her come up. I heard her stand a long time. I heard the board scrape, very small, and then the sound of a child eating who is trying to eat slowly and losing. And I worked my netting needle and minded my own business as hard as I have ever minded it in my life. When I did look, the fish was gone, the kelp was gone, and she was sitting on the floor with her back against the warm stone of the firebox chimney with the steam from the seawater pan drifting over her, and her skin where the damp touched it had gone from rope gray back toward green the way a tide pool comes back to life when the water returns. Her eyes were on me. They were amber, the deep amber of lamplight through whiskey, and they were too old for the rest of her, and they did not blink when mine met them. I held up the card with her face on it so she could see what I was holding. The breath went out of her very quietly and her shoulders came up, and I felt like a man pointing a gaff at a child, so I stopped. I leaned over and opened the firebox door, and the heat came out orange across the floor between us. It would have been one motion to feed the card to it. I am not sure to this day why I did not, except that some stubborn clerkish corner of me said a man should keep the paper that names the thing he has decided to do, so that later nobody can tell him he did not know. I folded the card and put it in my oilskin pocket and buttoned the flap, and I looked at her and pointed at the pocket and then at the floor of my smokehouse. "Stays with me," I said. "You too. Nobody collects." I did not know then how much of compact tripigeon she had, all of it, as it turned out, and 3 other tons besides. But that night she gave me nothing back except a long look and then one small thing. She moved her flat hand, the crooked webbed one, an inch toward me along the floor, not reaching, just no longer braced to swing. That was the whole treaty, signed and witnessed. An old man, a smoked fish, a warm stone in one hand gone quiet. Outside the gale was wearing itself down to a sulk, and the 4 lamps were a mile south being lied to by an empty cave. And in my pocket sat a piece of card that said 6,000 standards, and on my floor sat the reason that number had stopped meaning anything at all. I made her a bed that night in the brine loft over the cellar, where the salt air off the holding tanks keeps everything damp the year round, and the mold has defeated me since the year I built it. I laid out sacking and an old wool blanket and a basin of clean seawater, and she watched every piece of it happen from the doorway like an inspector with doubts. When I hung the lamp on its nail and stepped back, she went past me, quick and silent, and folded herself into the corner where the bedding met 2 walls, facing the ladder, always facing the way trouble would have to come from. A child should not know to do that. She knew it the way I know weather. "Sleep," I told her. "Tide turns at 4. Nothing on this quay moves before 5 but me, and I am slow." I do not think she understood the joke, or if she did, she filed it away with everything else and spent it later, because she has never once let me forget being slow. But as I went down the ladder, I heard her breathing change, the ration sips lengthening out into something almost like trust, and just at the turn of the tide, when the pilings groan and the water out on the pale reach changes its mind, I heard her hum 3 notes. Low, then lower, then a rise that stops short, cut off the way a man stops himself saying a name in company. 3 notes in silence, as if the song had a hole in its middle where something ought to live and didn't. I stood at the foot of the ladder with my hand on the rail and listened to that silence for a long while. I was 68 years old. I had no wife, no children, no debts, and no plans beyond the autumn run of silverfin. I had a smokehouse, a dory, a bad knee, and now a card in my pocket with a child's face on it and a price where her name should have been, and 4 polite men at the tide glass in drying their boots. One night, I told myself, climbing to my own bed. Just the one night. And in the morning I would think sensibly about all of it. I have been wrong about weather maybe a dozen times in 40 years. About that, I was wrong the way the drowned are wrong about the sea. Morning showed me what the lamplight had only guessed at. She was small, smaller than the night had made her, with the fine bones of a shorebird and that gray-green skin that ran darker along her spine and paler at her throat, patterned faintly like light on shallow water if you caught it at an angle. The webbing ran between every finger to the first knuckle. Her hair was short and the white of cuttlebone, pushed back from 2 ears that rose to soft points, and along the hinge of her jaw, when she turned her head, lay 3 pale seams, closed tight in the dry air, that I took for what they were and asked no questions about. She was at my smokehouse window when I came down, standing well back from the glass the way you stand when you want to see without being seen, watching the quay come awake, not watching the boats, watching the people, counting them, learning their gaits, sorting which ones moved like they had somewhere to be, and which ones moved like they were paid to look idle. I poured 2 mugs of black tea and put one on the sill near her and drank mine, and we watched my neighbors together in silence like 2 old men at a fence. The first word she ever gave me was salt. Mid-morning, her skin going to rope again despite the kettle steam, she pressed her flat palm to the lid of a brine tank and looked at me and said it, in trade pidgin in a voice rusty with disuse, salt not a request, a diagnosis. So we worked it out together with pointing and grunting and one short argument conducted entirely in eyebrows. The blanket got soaked in brine and wrung to damp, a kelp wrap for her shoulders for the bad hours. The seawater pan stayed on the firebox iron all day, every day from then on, in the smokehouse, which had smelled of smoke and fish and old man for 40 years, learned to smell of the tide as well. Food taught me the second lesson. I made porridge, because that is what you make for a child, and she took one mouthful to be polite, and I watched her go gray-lipped and quietly desperate, trying to keep it down for my sake. I took the bowl away from her, and that was the end of land grain in my house. Fish she took, kelp she took, the little blue rock crabs from under the slipway she took with an efficiency that frightened the cat from 2 doors down. Her body knew its own country. It was not mine, and there was no use being sentimental about it. Pesk came by before noon, which I had been expecting, because Pesk buys fish along this quay the way gulls attend a gutting, and nothing happens on Stonal Quay that he does not arrive shortly after. She heard his boots before I did and was gone into the racks without a sound, and I learned right then that the racks were her ground now, mapped and chosen, and that she had spent her first night not sleeping but learning my shed the way a pilot learns a channel. Pesk wanted to talk about the strangers. 4 of them, rooms at the Tide Glass, paying ahead by the week, he said, and the heavy one had been showing a card up and down the front street with a little gray face on it, and a number that made men lick their lips. A week paid ahead, he said again, and looked around my shed with those quick, wet eyes of his, at the racks, at the firebox, at the 2 mugs drying on the board by my basin where one mug had dried alone for years. A week means they think it is here, Joss, he said. Money like that does not pay ahead for caves. I told him money like that was none of my business and haggled him brutally over the mornings, Silverfin to give his brain something familiar to do, and he went away half convinced of nothing in particular, which with Pesk is the best a man gets. But I marked the 2 mugs, and after that I was more careful. A man with nothing to hide does not count his mugs. That afternoon I walked up the hill to Solit's. Solit has mended nets at the top of the cliff stairs since before I owned a boat, and he is the only Vale on this stretch of coast, old now the way driftwood is old, gone silver gray all over with his webs worn to lace. He came ashore after the Cinder War with a ruined shoulder and never said why, and in 30 years no one has been fool enough to ask twice. I sat on his bench and watched his needle go and asked him, in the long way of coast talk, what it would mean if a Vale child were to turn up on this shore alone, saying if loudly enough that we both heard it for what it was. His needle stopped. First time I ever saw it stop with daylight left. What it would mean, he said, is that somewhere out on the reach a creche boat broke, or was broken. He told me then what I had half known from harbor gossip, how the war scattered the Vale flotillas, drowned some lines whole, drove the rest into compact waters as refugees. How the compact wrote the Restitution Act, money set aside in bond for every displaced Vale child, payable to verified kin upon reunification. A decent law, Solet said, written by decent men, and within a year of its writing there were people on 40 coasts whose whole trade was finding bonded children and finding them some kin. He said the word kin the way you spit a bone. Last winter, he said, a child came ashore at Harrow Point. 2 days' sail north. Word went out, and inside a month a man and woman arrived with papers saying second cousins, and the bond was paid, and they took the child away on the southbound packet. And at the spring tide, a fisherman Solet knew wrote him that the same man and woman had been seen on the Vela's coast with different papers and no child at all. No one knows where that child is, Solet said. The bond is cashed. The file is closed. The compact does not pay twice, so the compact does not look twice. His needle started again, slower. If a child turned up on this shore, he said, an old human who happened to find her would be sitting on the only thing on this coast worth 6,000 standards. The runners get a finder's fee, the agent gets a percentage, and the kin, Solet said, whoever proves to be kin, get the child and the bond and a closed file and no second look. That is the machine. It is fed at one end and it is clean at the other, and what happens in the middle is weather, and nobody writes down weather. Then he looked at me, the second lids drawing slow across his eyes and back, and said, tell her the brine must be cut 1 part in 10 with rainwater or her skin will crack at the folds, and bring me any net she mends, because a creche child splice is a thing I have not seen in 30 years and I find I miss it. I had said nothing about mending. I had said nothing about her at all. Only if. I walked back down the cliff stairs feeling the particular nakedness of a man who has just learned his secret has been a secret for less than a day, and found Dolch leaning on my slipway rail with his hands in his good coat, watching my smokehouse the way a buyer watches a boat he has already decided to make an offer on. He was friendly. That was the worst of him. He was always friendly. He talked about weather and the price of silverfin, and how a quay like this must see all sorts wash through, and I gave him an old man's wandering answers and let him steer. He steered to the 6,000. He said it twice more, rolling it around, watching my face for the gleam. He said a man my age, alone, no family, ought to think hard about what a number like that means at the end of a working life, and that the agent he served was a generous man about shares when things went smooth, and ungenerous about obstacles, and which of those an old fisherman chose to be was the only question on the table. Then his eye drifted past me to my open shed door and stopped. On the drying rack inside in plain view hung the morning's mending, my net, my twine, and 40 splices in it that no thick human fingers had tied, each one small and tight and woven sixfold, like frostwork, like nothing made on this coast in 30 years. I watched him almost know what he was seeing. He was a dryland man. To him it was rope. His gaze slid along it and came back to me, and the moment passed, and only the sweat at my back stayed to mark that it had happened at all. I smoke fish, I told him, the same as I had told him the first night, flat as a tide table. He smiled and pushed off the rail and said he was sure that was so, and that they would be around, the weather being what it was, and he walked off up the front street with the unhurried walk of a man being paid by the day. That evening I took the net down before lighting my lamp, and I told her as evenly as I could that her splices were beautiful, and that beautiful was a thing we could no longer afford in daylight. She listened with her eyes on the rack, and what I saw cross her face was not fear. It was self-disgust, a workman's anger at his own sloppiness, and it sat so strangely on a small face that I laughed before I could help it, and she stared at me, and then something happened at the corner of her mouth that was not a smile, but was within sight of one. The first. I marked it down in the ledger I had started keeping in my head, the one with no numbers in it. At the turn of the tide that night, the 3 notes came again through the floorboards, low, lower, the rise cut short, and the silence after them. The next night the same, and the next. A song with its middle missing, sung in a salt loft by a child keeping watch on a ladder, in a house owned by a man with her price in his pocket. On the 4th night I asked her about it, the lamp low, her supper board scraped clean between us. What is the song? She was quiet so long I thought the question had sunk without touching bottom. Then she said, in that rusted little voice, not looking at me, it isn't finished. And I, being old and a fool and wanting badly to give her something, said, well, songs can be finished. She looked up at me then, the amber eyes catching the firebox glow, and she said, not by me, and went up her ladder, and that was the end of talking for that night. I sat by the firebox a long time with my cold tea and let myself think, for the first time in the 4 days since the lamps came up my quay, about how this would actually go. The runners were paid by the weak and patient. The card was on every coast by now. Somewhere an agent of record was doing what agents of record do, and the machine Saul it described was turning, fed at one end, clean at the other, and the law itself, the decent law written by decent men, was the belt it ran on. A man could hide a child from 4 runners for a while, on a quay he had known for 40 years. No man could hide her from a closed file. So I would not hide her then. I would have to be ready, when the machine came to my door wearing papers and a clean collar, to stand in front of it in public and make it prove every word it said. And the thought of that, me, a fish smoker with a 3rd form education and a bad knee against the Compact Restitution Act, should have sat on my chest like a wet anchor. I will not pretend it sat light. But under it that night and every night after ran 3 notes in a silence, and a man can brace a great deal of weight, I have found, on the place where a song is waiting to be finished. Before I slept, I went down and fixed a 2nd latch on the loft shutter, the seaward one, the one that opens onto the lean-to roof and the stacked crab pots, and for anything small and quick, the dark gap behind the brine tanks that no grown man can pass. She watched me do it from her corner without a word. I tested the swing of it twice, oiled the hinge, and left it unlocked. A way out, I told her, not for using. For knowing it's there. She nodded, one short nod, like a skipper signing off on a chart correction. And it occurred to me as I went down the ladder that I had stopped wondering whether she understood things. She understood everything. She had simply seen no profit yet in saying so, and I could not argue the policy. With her face on a card in 4 men's pockets, silence was the only currency a child could mint herself, and she was rich in it. Let them have the caves, then. Let them have the front street and the tide glass and their week paid ahead. I had the racks, the brine loft, The second latch, an old veil up the cliff stairs who missed creche splices, and a tide that turned twice a day under both of us, regular as a heart. It was not much of an army. It was what the coast had on hand. The weeks that followed taught me my trade twice over. I had thought I knew water. I knew it the way a man knows a wife of 40 years, by habit and instrument and long forgiveness. She knew it the way blood knows blood. It came out in small ways first. She would stand at the seaward window of a flat, calm morning with her palm against the glass and say, in that dry little ledger voice, "Big swell tomorrow from the south." And I would look at a sky like a pressed sheet and the glass steady on my barometer and say nothing. And the next day the southerly swell would come walking up the reach exactly as ordered. Her skin read pressure the way my eyes read print. The seams along her jaw, closed tight in dry weather, would soften half a day before rain. By the third week I had quietly stopped consulting the barometer at all, and if the harbormaster's office had known their forecasts were being outperformed by a child in a kelp wrap, there would have been words. The morning of the white squall there were words anyway, but they were hers and they saved my life. I was loading the dory for the outer lines, a high pale day, wind light at west, every boat on the quay rigging out. She came down the slipway fast, no caution, in daylight in the open, which she never did, and took hold of my sleeve with a webbed hand and said one word, "No." I looked at the sky and the glass and the 7 other boats standing out of the harbor mouth, and then I looked at the seams along her jaw, open wide, fluttering, and I unloaded my dory and stayed home feeling like a fool for 1 hour and 40 minutes, which is when the squall line came over Hag's Teeth, with no more warning than a shadow, white water from rock to rock, and took the whole fleet's gear and very nearly took Barrack's boy with it. 7 boats lost their outer lines that day. Mine were coiled in my shed. There is no hiding luck like that on a working quay, and I did not try. I stood the front street around at the tie glass and grumbled about my knee, reading the weather, and they laughed at the old man and his knee, and Dolch, sitting in the corner with his ledger and his patience, watched me over his cup and did not laugh at all. It was that same week I carved the whistle. There was a piece of pale driftwood on the slipway, worn into a curve that fit a small hand, and an old man's evenings are long, and a knife wants work. I cut it as a tide whistle, the kind the channel pilots used when I was a boy, 3 holes, loud enough to carry over weather. I told myself it was a tool, not a toy, and that a child posted as lookout, which she had appointed herself without consulting me, ought to have a way of raising the alarm that was not her own voice. The truth underneath, which I did not look at straight, was that I wanted her to have one thing on her body that was hers given and not salvaged. She turned it over twice when I gave it to her, learning it with her fingertips the way she learned everything, and then she hung it around her neck on a length of tarred twine and pushed it inside. The kelp wrapped flat against her chest, and it never left her again. She did not say a word. 3 nights later, I found my best splicing knife sharpened to an edge I could not have put on it with a year of Sundays, lying square in the middle of my work table like an invoice marked paid. It was Ida Prowl who brought the weather indoors. She came down to my shed herself, which harbor masters do not do, and stood in my doorway in her oiled coat, turning her cap in her hands. And Ida has known me since she was a deckhand, and I will not pretend her face that morning did not frighten me more than 4 lamps had. "There is paper moving, Joss," she said. An agent of record had filed with her office. Notice of an active restitution claim, coast-wide, with her quay named on the routing list, and the runner's weekly reports going somewhere and coming back stamped. "You know what I think of you," she said, "and I will not insult either of us asking what you have in your loft. But a posted bond is a posted bond, and if it comes to papers, the law is all I am. Get ahead of it. Get something on file on your side of the ledger before somebody else writes the whole page." Then she put her cap on and looked past me at the racks and said, louder than she needed to, that her office had recorded a castaway taken into shelter on Stonnell Quay under harbor custom, species noted, date noted, shelter holder 1 Joss Marrow, smokehouse and slip 9, and that the relevant fee was 1 standard, payable at my convenience. "The shelter right is older than the compact," she said. "It will not beat a kin claim, but it makes you a party with standing instead of an obstacle with a price on his removal. And the difference between those 2 men, Joss, is the difference between a hearing and an accident." I paid her the standard out of the tea tin there, and she wrote me a receipt in her terrible hand, and that 1 standard bought what 6,000 could not have, standing. A line of my own in the file that could not be closed without my name in the room. I needed it faster than either of us guessed, because Bartolin Hennick came in on the next packet boat. I knew him before he stepped off the gangway. Not his face, his kind. A narrow man kept carefully soft, dressed for a town 3 sizes bigger than ours, with a traveling case in one hand and the other hand free and open and ready to be offered, and eyes that went down my quay slip by slip, pricing it, the way other men's eyes go over a woman or a horse. The runners straightened when they saw him the way dogs straighten, and Dolch, who had been 3 weeks pretending to be idle, was suddenly and visibly an employee. He came to my shed within the hour, alone, hat in hand, and introduced himself as the agent of record in the matter of the bonded miner, and asked, with great courtesy, whether he might trouble me, as the holder of a registered shelter, for a few minutes on a matter to everyone's advantage. I will give him this much. He never once lied to me with facts. The facts were all true and arranged like fish hooks. He sat at my work table and laid them out. The bond, 6,000. The child alone undocumented, a charge upon a man of, he hoped he could say it without offense, modest means and advancing years. The law, clear. Kin would be located. Kin were no doubt already being located. The Vale kept registries, and the registries had survived the war in better order than the families had. And when kin appeared, the claim would be heard and granted, and the child would go to her own people, where he said, looking around my smokehouse at the racks and the brine tanks and the salt-streaked window, surely a man who cared for her must in his heart want her to be. And in recognition of shelter rendered, he said, the standard finder's share, 600, payable to me on transfer, with a further consideration available, at his discretion, for what he called a smooth and uncontested process. He let the silence after that do its work. He was good at silences. He had bought and sold a great many of them. I let it lie there between us until it had gone fully cold, and then I told him the truth, because Saulette was right about machines, and I wanted this one to know it had been seen. I said I had heard about Harrow Point. I said the word kin could mean people who shared your blood, or people who shared a forger, and that on this coast we had lately had reason to learn the difference, and that any claim on the child in my shelter would be heard in front of the whole quay with the legation present, because I would put my one standard's worth of standing against his 6,000, and we would see what the water said. Hennick did not flush or bluster. Interest came up in his eyes like a lamp behind smoked glass, the first honest thing I had seen in him. He stood, took his hat, thanked me for a productive conversation, and at my door he paused and said mildly, as a man remarks on the tide, I never file a claim I cannot cash, Mr. Merrill. It has been the ruin of better agents. Good day to you. 3 days later, the notice went up on the fish hall door. Verified kin located and confirmed. A hearing under compact law and Vale custom. The legation to send a speaker. The parties to appear at the next spring tide but one. And that same week, because Hennick's other hand was never idle, a compact licensing inspector none of us had ever seen found my brine tanks non-compliant with regulation younger than my boots, and the fine was 200 standards, payable before I could lawfully sell another fish. I sold the engine out of my second dory to cover it, rode the harbor like my grandfather, and told my knee it was tradition. The quay watched all of it happen, the notice, the inspector, the engine going up the front street on Barrack's cart, and the quay is not stupid. Half of it understood exactly what was being done to me and why. The other half began quietly, in the way of small places, to do its sums about old Joss and the gray child and 6,000 standards, and which of those an honest man would keep if he could only keep one. She read the notice herself. I had not meant her to. I came up from the slip and found her at the fish hall door in the gray of first light, hood up, stone still in front of the paper with her own face printed on it and the words verified kin above a name she did not know. I stood beside her and we read it together, and she was silent all the way home, and at the door of the shed she stopped and looked up at me, and asked the question I had been dreading in a voice with no child left in it at all. How much, she said, for me? How much? There are questions you must not flinch from because the flinch is the answer. I took the old card out of my oilskin pocket, the one Dolch left the first night, and unfolded it and let her read the number because she had earned the truth and would smell anything less. She looked at it a long moment. Then she looked up at me with those amber eyes and asked what I had paid Ida. And I said one standard and told her what it had bought. The shelter line, the standing, the name in the file. She thought about that the way she thought about weather, with her whole body very still. And then she said, more than them, and went inside and put the kettle on, and I stood on my own doorstep with my eyes stinging, and not from smoke, and understood that I had just been valued by the only assessor whose ledger mattered, and had come out, by her arithmetic, ahead of the Compact Restitution Act by 5,999. That night the 3 notes came again at the turning tide, low, lower, the rise that stops. But she sang them twice that night, and the second time the silence after them was shorter, as if she had leaned out over the hole in the middle of the song to see how deep it went. The spring tide but one, 23 days. I cleaned my one good coat, and sharpened nothing, and started listening very carefully to everything Saulette was willing to say about exactly what walks into a kin hearing and what it must carry, and what, in 30 years of bitter watching, he had ever seen make one fall apart. Songs, he said at last when I had asked it plain. Paper burns, seals can be bought, grief can be rehearsed. But every line that ever sailed the reach keeps its own song, and a child raised 1 hour in her right creche has it in her bones. And there is no forging it, because the song is not information. It is upbringing. It is 10,000 nights of the tide turning under one particular deck. Then he was quiet a while, mending, and without looking up he said, "She hums it at the turn, does she?" "Half of it," I said. "Yes," Solid said. "Half is what an unraised child gets. The cradle verses come with the blood. The middle is sung to her, year, by whoever stands at her shoulder while she grows. And it is different for every child, because every raising is different. A song with no middle is a registry entry with no life in it." He bit his twine off and looked at me at last, and his old second lids drew slowly back, and his eyes underneath were wet and perfectly steady. "Whoever claims her," he said, "will be claiming the right to fill that silence. So you will forgive me, Joss, if I attend this hearing of yours, and sit where the speaker can see me, and listen very carefully indeed to everybody's music. The souls came in on the noon packet 11 days before the hearing, and I will say this for them. They were the best I ever saw at what they did, and what they did was grief. The whole Front Street happened to be out when the packet warped in, the way a whole Front Street can happen to be out when word has run ahead. They came down the gangway into that audience like rain onto dry ground. A veil man and a veil woman, sea folk dark, dressed plain and good, the man carrying one worn case, and the woman carrying nothing but her 2 hands, pressed together at her mouth. Marin and Tethy Sol, second-line cousins by the drowned ledger, the paper said, of a creche boat lost off the Velas shallows in the last year of the war. And the woman stopped dead in the middle of the gangway, and her hands came down from her mouth, and she looked along the quay to where Karu stood in plain sight at my side, because we had decided, Karu and I and Ida between us, that the days of racks and brine cellars were done, and standing meant standing in daylight. And Tethsel cried out across the harbor in the Vale tongue, high and broken, a sound that needed no translating, and ran the length of the quay with her arms open. Karu did not move, not toward her, not away. She stood with her hand in mine, and I felt through that small webbed hand exactly what was in her, and it was nothing. No spark, no terror, no flood of the blood knowing its own. Polite nothing. In front of a stranger, the same nothing she had given Pesk. Tathy Sol went to her knees on the wet stone in front of the child, which played to the whole street, and wept beautifully, and said, in trade pigeon now, for the audience, "Forgive me. Forgive me, you are so small. You cannot remember me." And the crowd around us made the sound crowds make, low and warm and already half decided. The man, Marin, came up slower with his case and his hat off. Grief carried with dignity, and behind them both, timing his arrival like a man stepping onto a stage he addressed himself, came Hennick. That was the picture the quay took home to its suppers that night. The weeping kinswoman on her knees, the dignified kinsman, the orphan stone still and staring, too hurt, the Front Street said, nodding to itself, too hurt by everything to know her own blood, poor scrap, and behind it all the old fish smoker with his face shut, holding the child's hand too tight. And who is he, when you think about it, to stand between a child and her family? A stranger to her own kind, keeping her in a smoke shed, and the bond, of course. 6,000. You cannot tell me a man rows a harbor at his age and never thinks of it. Pesk said that last part out loud 3 nights later, in the fish hall. At the open meeting Ida was obliged by custom to hold before any hearing, said it to my face with the hall full, that everyone wept very prettily for blood and kin, but there was one man in the room who stood to lose 6,000 standards worth of free splicing and weather witching the day that child walked up a gangway, and he was sitting right there, and perhaps the legation ought to hear about that as well. I had known Pesk 40 years. I had pulled his brother out of a March sea in my second-best decade and stood at the man's wedding. The hall went very quiet, and a good half of it did not look away from me, which told me the half that agreed with him, and I stood up with my cap in my hands, because a thing like that must be answered standing or it stands itself. I said he was right. That stopped the buzz of it. I said the child's work was worth money, and her weather sense was worth more, and any man who pretended a skilled pair of hands in the house was worth nothing was either rich or lying. So count it, I said. Count everything she is worth to me, and when you have your figure, set it next to what I have already paid out and let the hall do its sums. 1 fine of 200 standards, 1 engine, sold, 1 smokehouse, made non-compliant by paper that followed her through my door. And the only line in this whole affair with my name on it is a shelter fee that cost me 1 standard and cannot pay me anything back but trouble. I am 68, I told the hall. If I am running a business here, it is the worst-run business on this coast, and you all know how I haggle. That got the laugh, and the laugh broke Pesk's wave before it crested. But it did not turn the tide, and I did not fool myself it had. Walking home, I heard a woman I had known 30 years say to her husband, soft, But he could just give her over to her own people and be done, couldn't he? And there it was, the deep current under everything, the one Hennick had been steering by from the start, her own people. The words did all his work for him. All he had ever needed was for the Quay to keep believing that what stood on his side of the hearing was her people, and what stood on mine was an old man's loneliness wearing a shelter receipt. The probing started that same week. Redzo came at the shed in the dark of the moon, third hour, over the lean-to roof, quiet for a big man, and found the loft shutter latched, because the second latch I had fitted that first week went home every night at dark now, and the seaward window lamplit, because an old man's bladder keeps strange hours, and me sitting in the dark of the racks with the boat gaff across my knees, because her jaw seams had been fluttering since supper time, and I had learned to take the forecast. He put his pry bar to the shutter, and I spoke through the boards, conversational, the way you speak to a man you have known for years. I said the shutter was new fitted and a shame to mark, and that the smokehouse was a registered shelter, and that a man entering one by night on this coast could lawfully be met with anything its holder could lift, and that what I had lifted, he should know, was a gaff with a 4-inch hook, and my hands knew it better than they knew my own face. Then I asked after Dolch's health, by name, friendly. There is a particular silence a man makes when a plan has died in his hands. I heard it through the shutter, a long count of it, and then his boots going back over the lean-to, careful and down by the crab pots, and away. I sat where I was until the tide turned and overhead. Just at the turn, the 3 notes came down through the floor, low, lower, the cut-short rise. She had been awake the whole of it, of course. Lookouts do not sleep on a flood tide. But she had stayed in her loft and let me hold the door, and I understood what that was too. It was trust, of the only kind her life had left her the parts for, not believing the danger would stay out, believing she knew which man was standing in front of it. The law gave the souls a supervised visit before the hearing. Ida's office, Ida present, me allowed in the corner by the child's plain refusal to enter the room otherwise. Hennick by the door with his ledger like a verger at a service. The souls brought gifts, and the gifts were correct the way everything about them was correct. A comb of sea ivory, a folded cloth of flotilla weave, and Tetha talked, gently steadily in the veil tongue and in pidgin, of the lost creche boat, of Karu's blood mother. Second cousin on the water side, of how long they had searched the registries. And it was good, all of it. It was as good as paid grief gets. But I had cured fish 40 years, and curing teaches you to read what a thing is by what it does, not what it is wrapped in, and from my corner, with nothing to do but watch, I watched the things their hands did while their mouths were perfect. Marin set out food for the child. Hospitality, custom nicely judged. And among the dried fish and the kelp paper, set down square in front of her like a thing done every day, a wheat cake. Land grain from the packet's galley stores. Karu looked at it and did not move, and Tathy's hand came across, smooth as a gull's turn, and slid the cake aside and broke it absently, as if it had always been meant for the grown-ups, and the talk never caught its breath. Quick, clean. But I had been 3 weeks learning, the hard way, with a porridge bowl, what every veiled deckhand alive knows from his own childhood, that a creche child's gut cannot take land grain before her second molt. And the man claiming to have crossed half the reach for love of his cousin's daughter had just set poison in front of her with a kindly smile, and the woman had covered it without ever once looking down, the way you cover a colleague's slip, not the way you mind a child's diet. I said nothing. I let my face be an old man's face, vague in a warm room. But I went home and I wrote it on the back of Dolk's card, the first entry in a list, and under it I wrote the second thing, which was worse, and which I had almost missed for its smallness. In 2 hours of weeping, of memory, of forgive me you were so small, neither of them not once had spoken her name, the girl, the child, our blood, our cousin's daughter, little one, every soft word in 2 languages, never Karu. A name is the first thing grief reaches for and the last thing it lets go. I have stood with the families of drowned men all my life, and I know what they call the lost, and it is the name always the name, worn smooth as beach glass with the saying of it. She did not know their song, they did not know her name. The hearing was 9 days out, and somewhere under all those correct papers there was a hole the exact shape of an upbringing, and I had 8 evenings and an old net mender up the cliff stairs to learn how to make a quay full of decent, half-fooled people see it. That night at the turn of the tide the 3 notes came again through the floorboards, and stopped, and the silence where the middle of the song should have been lay over my house like held breath. I lay awake in it, an old man with a list on a card, and I thought, not for the first time, that the silence was the truest paper in the whole file. Everything else could be forged. The whole could not. The whole was real, you could hear its edges, and nobody on the reach could sing across it but the one who had earned the right night by night at the shoulder of a growing child. I did not know yet that I was going to say exactly that, 9 days on, in front of the speaker and the whole assembled coast. But I had begun, in the way of slow men, to know that I knew it, and somewhere above my head, between the brine tanks and the salt loft and the patient-turning sea, the hole in the song was waiting to hear it said. 8 days out, the sea tried to settle the whole question itself by drowning me, and was beaten off by a child with a driftwood whistle. It was the big spring run, the last chance before the hearing to put fish on my racks and standards in my tin, both of which the fine and the lawyering had bled white. The flats east of Hag's Teeth bear out a mile on the big springs, and a man who knows the ground can work the channel pools on foot at the bottom of the tide and take silverfin trapped there by the basketful. Every quay child learns the one rule of the flats before they learn to swim. The tide does not come back in like a guest, it comes back like news. On the biggest springs it comes as a bore, a standing wave that walks up the channel faster than an old man runs. And the flats that took you an hour to cross will take 4 minutes to close. I knew all that. I had worked those pools 50 years. I also had a tin with 9 standards in it and a coat that needed to stand in front of a speaker, so I took the risk the way poor men take them, with my eyes open and the arithmetic done a little too much in my own favor. And the arithmetic was wrong, because the pools were rich that morning, and a rich pool is a thief's lantern. I filled both creels and started one pool farther and one more after it. And the wind backed southerly without my noticing the way it will when your back is bent, and a southerly on a big spring pushes the flood early and hard. Carew was on the cliff path. She was always on the cliff path when I worked the flats, my self-appointed lookout, hood up against the gull's noise and what her eyes missed her skin caught. She told me after, in her ledger voice, that the seams at her jaw had opened all at once, not slowly as for rain, and the sea had gone wrong colored out by the teeth, the gray-green of it sliding to brown where the channel runs. And she had seen the line of the bore while it was still 2 miles out, a thin white seam across the water like a fault in glass, and she had not wasted 1 second of it shouting, because a shout into a southerly is spent the moment it leaves you. She blew the whistle. 3 holes, the pilot's call, the one I had taught her idly of an evening, never thinking. High doubled, carrying over wind the way it was cut to do, again and again and again. And down on the flats, bent over a pool with my hands full of fish and my ears full of wind, I heard it thin and far, and I straightened up like a man called by name and saw the white seam walking and dropped 1 full creel where I stood and ran. I do not run well. The knee filed its protest at the 2nd pool and went to arbitration at the 4th. The bore came up the channel to my left with a sound I had heard twice before in my life, both times from a boat, a low tearing hush like the sky being opened along a seam, and the water in the pools around me began to tremble and stand and reach for it, and the whistle on the cliff never stopped. 3 and 3 and 3, marking me the line to the stair the way a leadsman marks a channel, because from her height she could see the runnels, and standing water I could not. And she had worked it out, that child, in the time it takes to draw breath, that the whistle could steer as well as warn. Long blast for bear up, too short for bear away. We had no such code. She made it and trusted me to read it, and I read it, because by then we had spent a season reading each other, and I came up the bottom of the cliff stair with the water swirling warm around my boots. 1 creel down, 1 creel saved, lungs like burst bellows, alive. She came down the path and stood over me while I sat on the steps and shook. She did not cry or scold. She looked at me a long time with the whistle still in her fist, and then she said, with the deadly precision she saves for her largest feelings, "You are slow," and sat down on the step against my side, under my arm, where she had never once put herself before, and we watched the sea close my morning's ground like a door. And I felt her shaking too, and neither of us remarked on the other's weather. Word of it ran the quay by supper as everything did. Old Joss caught on the flats by the spring bore and whistled home by the gray child, a story with warmth in it. And it bought us something in the front street. I could feel the buying. But it bought something else, too, in a colder shop. It told Hennick, plain as a posted notice, that the child was the old man's eyes and the old man was the child's ground, and that 9 days of patient lawyering stood between him and his percentage while the 2 halves of his merchandise grew together like grafted stock. I believe to this day that the flats put the idea in him. Hennick never wasted weather. 2 days later he moved. A motion to Ida's office, filed correct and early, citing the incident on the flats as evidence of, the paper said, an unsafe and irregular shelter environment, the minor performing hazardous labor, the holder of advanced age and demonstrated poor judgment, and requesting the child free transfer to the agent's secured care pending the hearing for her own protection. For her own protection. I read it twice and had to walk the length of the quay before my hands would behave. Ida denied it the same day. The shelter right, she wrote, is older than the compact and admits no pending. A castaway in shelter remains in shelter until a lawful claim is granted, and the compact's own act incorporates coastal custom were not explicitly superseded, and nothing in the file superseded it, and the motion was denied, and the fee for filing it was 2 standards, payable now. I heard from her clerk, who is Barrack's eldest and loyal to the quay, how Hennick took it. He read it standing, perfectly still, and then he smiled and paid the 2 standards in coin, and said pleasantly to no one in particular, "Shelter ends at the waterline, harbor master," and went out. Shelter ends at the waterline. I turned that over for 2 days like a hook in my pocket and could not decide what it was promising, and that was my failure, not his. He had told me the way confident men cannot help telling you. I heard it as lawyer spite. It was a sailing plan. Then it was 5 days and Tetha's soul came to my shed alone. She came at dusk openly up the slipway with her hood back and asked at my door, very simply, might she speak with me, one keeper of the child to another, and what was I going to do, leave a woman on the stones? Karu watched from the racks, in plain sight, still as gear, and Titha did not press toward her, did not perform at all this time, and that, I admit, worked on me more than the gangway ever had. She talked quietly. She said she knew what I thought of them. She said grief travels strangely in scattered families, that she and Marin had searched 3 coasts, that perhaps they had done it all wrongly, arriving with weeping in front of strangers, frightening the child they came to gather. She spoke of the flotilla life waiting, the schooling, cousins, the sea trades, her own kind around her, and then she leaned into the heart of it, gently, gently, like a woman banking a fire. "You are old," she said, and I say it with respect. 10 years, 15. What then? Will you leave her alone twice? Whatever the hearing says, old man, you cannot win her anything but a postponed grief. Let her go gently now with your blessing, and she keeps you whole in her memory. A kindness done her once by a stranger. Make her choose in a public hall, and whichever way it falls, you will have taught her that everyone who holds her hand ends as a wound. I am not made of oak all through. That found the joints. I had thought it myself at the firebox at 3rd hour more nights than one, the actuary's truth under all my stubbornness, 10 years, 15. What then? I stood in my own doorway with my throat working and nothing wise to say, and I came as near to wavering as I ever came in the whole affair. And then she finished it. She straightened her cloak to go, and looked past me at the small shape in the racks, and said with the perfect warmth of a closing argument, "Be wise for her then. She deserves better than a smoke shed," and her voice did not change at all on the next words. "The girl has had enough taken. Let her keep this last thing, the girl, all evening, the girl, the child, she, and once, when she had been speaking of registries and the searching of them, our cousin's daughter, registry Vale-stroke K771. I stood there hearing all of it again in one breath, every soft word of 2 languages from 2 visits in a gangway, and the name Carew in none of it, not once, not from her, not from Marin, and a cold, clean quiet came up in me and put everything wavering to bed. Because I knew that registry string better than they did. It was on the card in my oilskin pocket above the number with the zeros. They had her file. They had never had her name. Grief reaches for the name first. I have stood with the drowned's people, and I know the name, always the name, said until it is smooth. You do not learn that in a registry. You earn it at a shoulder, night by night, and there was only one party to this hearing who had done a single night of it, and she was standing in my racks with a driftwood whistle around her neck, listening to a stranger call her the girl. I thanked Tithasol for her visit, and said we would all be wise on the day, and shut my door and stood with my back against it. Carew came out of the racks. She had heard every word, the 10 years, the 15, the postponed grief, all of it, and she looked up at me and asked her questions straight, as she asks everything. If the hearing says them, will you make trouble? The law is the law, I said, and the truth is the truth, and where they quarrel, I am too old to be retrained. Then I crouched down, knee and all, to put my eyes level with her eyes the way she had taught me without a word she preferred, and I told her the rest of it plain, because she was owed plain. Nobody is taken off my rack unless I hand them across, I said. And I do not hand across to people who poison what they cannot pronounce. They have a paper with you on it. I have you. We will see which the water honors. That night at the turn, the 3 notes came down through the boards, low, lower, the rise cut short, and then, before the silence could settle in its accustomed place, an old voice, cracked and tuneless and shameless, hummed them back up through the floor. The cradle verses, all I had, learned by months of nights the way the slow learn everything, by being there every single time. The loft above me went absolutely still. Then her face appeared in the ladder hole, upside down, hair hanging, eyes enormous, and she stared at me as if I had walked on the harbor, and she said, "You are not supposed to know that." "No," I said, "I am not. And nobody who was supposed to be there ever was, so the tide hired what it had." She looked at me a long time, upside down, unreadable. Then she said, "You sing very badly," and vanished upward, and I heard her settle into her corner, and I would not swear to it, mind, an old man's ears in a creaking house, But I believe that night, after the verses and before sleep, the silence in the middle of her song was, for the first time, a fraction shorter on one side, as if something had set one boot in the hole to test the ground. 4 days. I oiled the second latch, counted my 9 standards, brushed my coat, and slept like a man before weather. The legation cutter came in at slack water on the morning of the hearing, gray-hulled and silent, and the speaker came up Stonal Quay on foot, alone, which I am told is the custom, and which did more to quiet the front street than a marine guard could have. She was old. Old past Solid, old the way headlands are old, tall for her folk and thin as a mast, robed in the gray-on-gray of flotilla weave, her skin gone the color of winter sea, and her second lids drawing slow and deliberate over eyes that had you felt at once. Read a great many papers and a great many faces and rated the faces higher. Speaker Odesse of the legation of the scattered flotillas. She stopped once on her way up the quay at the fish hall door and read the posted notice from top to bottom, and the whole street watched her do it in a silence you could have cured fish in. They had cleared the hall and benched it like a court. The speaker at the head, Ida beside her for the compacts part, the Sulls and Hennick at one table with their advocate's case of papers, and me at the other with my 9 standards worth of nothing, a shelter receipt, and Dolce's card in my oilskin pocket with my list written small on the back of it. Karu sat where the speaker directed, to the side, in sight of everyone and reach of no one, with her hood back and the whistle on its tarred twine outside her wrap, in plain view, which was her own decision, and announced exactly what she meant it to announce. Solid sat in the second row where the speaker could see him, hands folded on his stick. Half the coast packed in behind. I will not give the whole morning. It went against me, as I had known it must, because Hennick was good and his clients were better. The papers came first, and the papers were a fortress. Registry extracts under War Archive seal, the drowned ledger of the Velas Shallows, lineage charts read aloud in 2 tongues, every page stamped, every stamp answered for. Ida examined the seals herself at the speaker's nod and could find no fault in one of them, and said so because Ida is the law all through, and the law was holding the other table's coats. Then the grief, presented as evidence. Teasel told the creche boat, the searching of 3 coasts, the registries combed by candle end, and she wept at the right places and refused to weep at others, mastering herself, which is the better performance. And I watched the hall lean to her like a tide. And then, because Hennick left nothing to chance, they sang. The line song of the soul claim, offered to the hearing under veil custom as proof of kinship, the advocate said, since song outlives paper. They stood together, the man and the woman, and sang it in the old tongue, and I will tell the truth as I am bound to. It was beautiful. Trained beautiful, every interval squared and fared, 2 voices fitted like planking. And it rolled out over that hall of fishermen who understood not one word, and it wet half the eyes in the room. Karu watched them sing it the way she had watched Pesk poke round my shed. The speaker watched Karu. Then came my turn in the rough. Pesk testified, and did it more sorrowfully than spitefully, which made it worse. The free labor, the weather witching, the 6,000, the old man alone who had, you could see it plain, grown attached past sense. Hennick's advocate read out the inspector's finding on my brine tanks and the incident on the flats, the miner performing hazardous duty as lookout while the shelter holder mispriced a spring tide he had known for 50 years, demonstrated poor judgment, advanced age, and I sat and took it because all of it was true, and a man who answers every wave swamps faster. The speaker questioned Karu near the end of the morning, and did it the only way that could have been done well, by sending the tables back and going to sit beside her on the bench, speaking too quietly for the hall to feast on it. We learned afterward she asked only the plainest things, whether the claimants were known to her, whether any face from before the war was known to her, whether she wished to speak. Karu answered what she could, which was little, and the advocate rose and said gently, with the air of a man closing a sale, that a child so young when the boat broke could carry no usable memory, that her silence proved nothing in either direction, and that where memory fails, the ledger must stand. And the speaker came back to her place and folded her hands, and said that unless any party had a question not yet asked, she was minded to rule upon the record as it stood, and the record, as it stood, was theirs. I have stood in the door of a wheelhouse with a sea making up a stern that I knew by arithmetic my boat could not outrun, and I have learned what you do, which is stop outrunning and turn and take it on the bow. I stood up. My knee spoke. The hall creaked round to me, and the speaker's old eyes came over and waited, patient as a headland. One question, I said, with the hearing's leave. For the claimants, leave was given. Marin Sol turned to face me with his dignified grief in good order, and Tethy beside him, composed, and Hennick behind them went very still in the way of a man whose machine has been running sweetly, and has just heard, far down in the works, a sound it cannot place. I asked it the way I had built it in my head through 4 sleepless tides, plain words, fisherman's words. No lawyer to them at all. Every night since she came to my shelter, I said, at the turn of the tide that child sings. Same notes, same place in the dark. You are her kin, you tell this hearing, near kin, searching 3 coasts for love of her. So tell the hearing this, and take your time, for there is a great deal of money on the answer. What does she sing when the tide turns? And why does she stop? The hall did not understand the question. I watched it not understand, rows of faces I had known all my life, puzzled at the old man asking about humming when there were seals and ledgers on the table. But the speaker understood it. Her second lids came back full and stayed back, and Saulet's second row leaned slowly forward onto his stick. And Tethasol, who was the best I ever saw at what she did, made her only mistake of the morning, which was to glance, one flick, the width of an eyelash, at Hennick. Then she answered, smooth as ever a woman answered, that the child would sing, of course, what every child of the lost boat sings, the line song of her blood, the very song the hearing had heard them offer, and that she stops, poor small one, she falters, because grief and the war had taken the rest of it from her as it had taken so much else. Wrong, twice in 14 words, in front of the one judge on 3 coasts equipped to count the wreckage. Wrong on the song, wrong on the why. I looked at the speaker, and the speaker looked at me, and I said, I am no singer, and I begged the hall's patience, and I hummed it. 3 notes, low then lower, then the rise. Cut off where it is always cut off, the hole in the middle of it held out open to the room, an old man's cracked tuneless humming in a dead silent fish hall with 6,000 standards and a child's whole life on the table. And across the hall, from the side bench in sight of everyone and reach of no one, Carew stood up and finished it. Not the 3 notes, the verse. Her voice came out into that hall small and clear and steady, in the old tongue, the cradle verses whole, the ones that come with the blood, rising to the place where her song always died, and she walked her voice up to the very lip of the hole in the middle and stopped there, on purpose, in the silence, and turned and looked at the sol table and said, in trade pigeon, in her ledger voice that carried to the back wall, finish it. They could not. The hall knew they could not before the hall knew what it was watching, the way a crowd smells a boat in trouble before it can say why. Marin Sol did not move. Tethasol opened her mouth, and what she had was the trained song, the wrong song, the squared and fared performance, and against that one small bare voice holding its breath at the edge of its own silence, she had the sense at least not to sing it. The advocate rose with custom and trauma and the ledger in his mouth, and the speaker put up one thin gray hand, and the hall heard it close like a hatch. Then Solet stood, slow with the stick, with 30 years of bitter watching paid into every inch of him, and asked the speaker's leave, and named it. The cradle verses the child had sung, he told the hearing, were Ulmir water, the Ulmir line, creche boats of the eastern shallows. He had mended nets to that song before the war as a young man, and would know it under any weather. And the song the claimants had offered the hearing as their blood proof was Selak water, western, no kin to Ulmir, within 9 ledgers, sung correct and cold as a paid choir. The papers say cousin, Solet said. The water says stranger. And on the reach speaker, since before there was paper, when the water and the paper quarrel, we bury the paper, for the water cannot be bribed. The speaker tested it, because she was old and careful, and the money on the table was the compacts. She asked Carew for the second cradle verse from its middle, cold, no run-up, and got it, instant and exact, the way you give your own name. She asked Tethasol for the Selak song's third verse from its middle, the song the woman claimed as her own blood's, and the woman struck it false on the second interval, because a rehearsed thing lives in its order and dies out of it, and every soul in that hall heard the difference between upbringing and training, between a child and a forgery, and the hall made a sound I had never heard it make in 40 years, low and long and cold. What was left went quickly, the way a stoveboat goes once the sea has its answer. The speaker impounded the registry extracts under legation seal for the War Archive to examine. She put to the sols, calm as soundings, the questions Hennick could no longer object to. The claim at Harrow Point in the winter past, a man and a woman, second-line cousins by the drowned ledger. The claim on the Vella's coast before it, and at Skellig Bar before that, and the fourth 2 years gone, in the south. 4 bonds, 4 children of 4 different lines, each one second-cousined out of a different drowned ledger, each file closed clean. And where, the speaker asked, in a voice that had not risen once the whole morning and did not rise now, are those children? The hall was so quiet I could hear the tide against the pilings. The sols said nothing at all. Their advocate said his clients claimed the protection of compact counsel, and the speaker said they would have every protection aboard the legation cutter, under seal, and the Marines came up the hall 2 and 2, and that was the gangway performance paid for in full. Hennick survived it, of course. While the hall still rocked, he was on his feet, regretful, precise, The agent of record himself deceived by forged instruments, withdrawing the claim with apologies. An agent is not his client, speaker. The file will show my office acted on certified papers throughout. And the file would show it. Files always showed it. For men like Hennick, that was what files were for. The speaker looked at him a long, long moment, the second lids half drawn, like a woman reading small print in bad light, and let him go. There was nothing yet in the room to hold him with. But I saw what she filed where no seal could reach it, and so did he, and his bow to her was a quarter-inch too deep. The ruling itself took less time than the reading of the notice had. Claim denied, bond standing. The child to remain in registered shelter on Stono Quay, the question of her permanent placement deferred to the flotilla's spring assembly, the legation to give notice. And then Speaker Odessi rose, stiff and tall and gray, and before the whole coast she turned not to the tables and not to the law but to the side bench, to Carew, and bent her old back and spoke to her in the veiled tongue a short sentence, and Carew answered with one word, and the speaker straightened and looked at me across that packed hall for an uncomfortably long time. Outside afterward on the quay steps, with the crowd flowing past us toward the front street and a story they would retell for 30 years, she stopped beside me, and her voice was for me alone. A human shoreman, she said, carrying Ulmer cradle water in his mouth. In 900 ledgers there is no entry for it. How does it come there? I gave her the only answer I'd ever had. I listened, I said. It was months of nights. There was a great deal of tide. She looked at me with those winter sea eyes, and the lids drew across and back, once slow, and what she said next she said quietly, and I have carried it since. Paper we can forge, she said, and grief we can train, and even blood, old man, is only weather that lasts. But nobody ever yet stood at a child's shoulder every night of a turning year for money. The water knows its own. It seems it is not particular about the species. Then she went down to her gray cutter, and I went home with Carew through a front street where every door stood open and nobody asked us for anything at all, and that should be the end of the story, and for 2 days I let myself believe it was. But Hennick had told me, weeks before in my own doorway, plain as a man can say a thing with witnesses by, I never file a claim I cannot cash, and shelter ends at the waterline. On the second night after the hearing, the fog came in off the reach at dusk, thick as carded wool, and the packet boat was gone from its mooring by midnight with no lights showing. And at the third hour, through the fog, from the loft above my head, the driftwood whistle screamed 3 holes worth of pilot's alarm once and stopped dead. I was on the loft ladder before the echo died, and the loft was empty. The seaward shutter stood open on the fog, the second latch not forced but cut clean from outside, a blade through the strap while she slept, and the bedding was still warm and the whistle was gone from her neck because she had spent her one free breath on blowing it for me instead of screaming for herself. On the lean-to roof the fog lay torn where men had passed, 2 men by the dents in it, and boots below by the crab pots, and down the back of the quay fading, quick and muffled, the knock of a sculled skiff being driven hard with rags on the thole pins. I wanted understood that I did not act in rage. Rage is a squall. It blows out. What came up in me on that lean-to roof in the fog was the other thing, the cold one, the thing that has kept slow old men alive on this water while quicker men drowned. And it thought, while my hands were already moving, in tide tables. Third hour, 2 nights past the big springs, the bore smaller but live, the flats channel flooding in the dark, a skiff with rags on its pins, running silent, no lights, in fog you could not see your own bow through, was not running for the harbor mouth and the open reach, where the legation cutter swung at her moorings with a watch set. It was running the short way, east, across the flooding flats by the channel, to round Hag's Teeth from inside and meet something standing off beyond them, something like a packet boat gone from her mooring at midnight with no lights showing. Shelter ends at the waterline. He had told me his whole sailing plan in 5 words and billed me 2 standards for the privilege. No stranger would dare the flats channel at night on a making tide. That was exactly why they were daring it, because no pursuit would follow, and the legation's deep-keeled cutter could not follow even if a slow old man woke it, which it could not before the meeting was made and the fog had swallowed everything. To run the flats channel in the dark, you would need a man who had worked that ground for 50 years and could steer it by the sound of the water on the sands alone. There was one of those on this coast. He owned a dory with no engine, and his knee hurt, and they had just taken his child. I did not go up the front street shouting. I wrote 4 words on a slate, "Gone East, Flats Channel," and hung it on Ida's office door where her clerk takes the dawn soundings, and then I went down my slipway and put my back into the oars. I will not stretch the chase longer in the telling than the water made it. The fog was total, the dark inside it absolute. I rode by the pilings, then by the bell on the channel stake, then by nothing but the sound of the sands. The flats speak as they drown, each bank with its own voice, runnels filling, lugworm ground hissing out its air, And a man who has heard it 5,000 mornings knows where he is the way you know whose footstep is on your stair. I rode inside their line. They had to feel for the channel. I owned it. The skiff ahead banked twice where the channel does not bank, and by the second time I was near enough to hear, between oar strokes, the voice of Dolch counting the stroke, and under it once, very small and flat and unafraid, in trade pidgin, a child's voice saying, "The water is wrong here, you should listen to it," and a slap of a hand on wet cloth and silence. She knew I would come. She was not even speaking to them. She was sounding for me, my little leadsman, telling me in the dark, through their own hull, exactly where they were. I did not need to catch them. That is what no one on the front street has ever quite believed, that I never meant to lay that skiff aboard like a pirate. 2 strong men in me with my gaff and my knee. I needed only to herd them, and the sea was already herding them for me. They were feeling down the channel's south side, the deep side, the sensible side, the side every chart and every instinct says is safe, and it is safe, until the last half-mile before Hag's Teeth, where the ebb of the year and the war year's storms cut a false channel that drowns at the 3rd hour of flood, smooth as a lie on top, with the old line gear of 40 years' wrecks waiting under it like a graveyard's teeth. Every quay child knows. No chart marks it. We do not mark it for the same reason you do not pull the nails from your own door, so I let them hear me. 1 stroke in 3, off their north quarter, an oars knocked plain on the thole, herding, the way you push fish to the net's mouth, and Dolch did what any hunted stranger does. He sheered south, away from the sound, into the smooth water and put on pace, and I lay on my oars in the fog, and listened to them go fast and confident and quiet onto the false channel, as the boar's first push came up the flats below us with its low tearing hush. Their prop of the night was muscle, but the gear of 40 wrecks does not care what is in your arms. I heard the first warp take their skeg, heard the curse, the backing water, the second snag, the skiff slewing, and then the boar's push arrived under all of us. Modest, 2 nights off the springs, a long swelling shoulder of sea. And on the clean channel where I lay it lifted my dory like a mother turning in her sleep, and on the false channel it broke, as it has broken every 3rd hour of flood since before the compact, white and sudden over the smooth, and I heard the skiff go over, and the men go in, and the night fill, with the particular blasphemy of strong swimmers finding out the bottom is netted. I rode to the sound of the child. There was never 1 second's doubt of finding her. The water that drowns a booted man insults a veil creche child. The sea is her front street, and she had gone out of that capsizing skiff like a gull off a rail, clear of the gear, the seams at her jaw wide open and working, and she found my dory before I found her and came over the gunwale at a stroke with the tarred twine, still around her neck and the whistle still on it, and her wrists were marked where they had been tied, and she had sawed the lashing through on a cleat edge in the dark, while Dolch counted strokes, which is why her hands were free to swim, and I looked at that and I put my coat around her over the kelp wrap, and the cold thing in me asked her its one question. "Hurt anywhere?" "No," she said. "Slow everywhere, but no." And the cold thing in me signed off its watch, and my hand started shaking on the oars, and her hand, the crooked webbed one, came onto my wrist and stayed there. And we sat a moment in the fog, the 2 of us, breathing, while 10 yards off in the dark 2 men screamed at the sea, and the sea, which cannot be bribed, discussed netting with them. Here is the part the front street still argues over its cups, and I will set it down plainly. I fished them out, both of them. Dolch first, because he was failing, and then Redzo off the snag he had clawed onto, the looped warp, the rolled gunwale, no speeches. Not because my heart was soft toward them. The cold thing did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was this: drowned men answer no questions, and there was an agent of record standing off in the fog beyond Hag's Teeth, waiting on his cargo, with his files all in order, and the only thing on this coast that could open those files was breathing its last in front of me, unless I chose otherwise. I have fished things out of this water for 50 years. That night I fished out the 2 warps that would haul down Bartle and Hennick, and I lashed them to my thwarts with their own belts. And Karu held the gaff across her small knees and watched them, not blinking, the whole pull home, and neither of them made the slightest difficulty. The fog thinned at dawn, and the dawn showed the rest of it. Ida had read my slate at the change of watch and done what harbor masters do. No shouting, just every light at the mouth and the legation cutter awake, and the packet boat, finding the fog lifting and her rendezvous empty and gray hulls on the water, had run for it and been laid aboard off the Teeth in the first light with Hennick's traveling case still half-packed. Dolch talked before his boots were dry. Men like Dolch always talk. Loyalty is a wage to them, and the wage had stopped. He talked of Harrow Point and Velez and Skellig Bar, of children handed across at sea to a labor brokerage's tender, of an agent of record who never once touched a child or a forgery with his own clean hands but built the machine and billed it by the hour. The file this once did not show what Hennick needed it to show, because the file met a witness, and behind the witness an old gray speaker who had filed her own findings where no seal could reach and was waiting for him at the bottom of the gangway like winter. They found 2 of the 4 children by the spring. I set that down because it is owed. A boy of the Tessera line and a girl of the Harrow claim, alive, worked hard and not kindly in a brokerage's sheds 3 coasts south, brought back to the flotillas under legation seal. The other 2 the Reach has not yet given up, and Speaker Odessi told me herself that those files would not be closed while she lived, and that men who turn children into closed files would learn, one tide at a time, what an open one costs. I think of those 2 children at the 3rd hour sometimes when the house creaks. So does she, I believe. It is a thing we have between us, and neither of us has ever needed to name it. The flotilla came up the Reach at the spring assembly, 11 sails, patched and proud, and the question of permanent placement that the hearing had deferred was heard on the open quay in sunlight with the whole coast for a witness. There were good homes offered on the water, and they were truly good. Cousins of the wide kind, schooling, her own tongue around her, everything Tethasol had promised falsely offered now in truth. And I stood there in my brushed coat prepared, fully prepared. I had practiced it at the farbox to say that an old man's claim on a child is the lightest thing in any harbor, and she must go where her life is longest. I never got to give my speech. The speaker asked Karu where her shelter stood. Karu, in front of 11 sails in the whole front street, took my hand, the crooked webbed fingers lacing into my thick ones, the way they had laced on a cliff stair once while the sea closed my mornings. Ground and said, in her ledger voice, carrying the smokehouse on slip 9, "It smells right and the man is slow, and I am not finished raising him." The hall of the open sky made the sound the fish hall had made at the song, only warm, and Speaker Odess, with the second lids half drawn over something that in a human's I would have named outright, opened the flotilla's great registry, the real one, the sung and written one that survived the war, and entered, under the Ulmir line, in the column where a raising is recorded, a thing that her clerk told Ida's clerk had no precedent in 900 ledgers. Shorkin, Joss Marrow, Smokehouse and Slip 9, Stonal Quay. Standing at the shoulder, and under hands in the old tongue, one word that Solid would not translate for me for a full year, and when he finally did, over his needle, not looking up, it was anchor. She is taller now. The webbing on the crooked notch healed straighter as she grew, and her splices sell for more than my fish, and the harbor master's office pays her, officially in standards, for a daily forecast that has not been wrong in 4 years. Solid is teaching her the Ulmir songs entire, all the verses her drowned creche never got to give her. And she takes them the way she takes everything, exactly, completely, and at her own chosen speed. The souls went into compact custody, and the brokerage went into legation record, and Hennick, I am told, files appeals, beautifully drafted, from a cell with no waterline at all. And the song has its middle now. That is the end of it, the only end worth setting down. Solid had told me the truth of it at his bench. The middle of a line song is not lost and not found. It is built, year on year, by whoever stands at the child's shoulder while she grows, every raising different, every middle its own. We built hers the slow way, nights, tides, smoke, salt, one cracked old voice and one clear small one, verse by patient verse, and at the turn of the tide, when the pilings groan and the water out on the pale Reach changes its mind, my house is not silent anymore. Some nights, climbing to my bed, I stop at the foot of the ladder and listen to her sing it through, beginning to end, no hole, no held breath. The middle verses rough-grained and tar-flavored because of where they came from, and I think about a piece of card I once nearly fed to a firebox, with a number on it where her name should have been. The compact valued her at 6,000 standards, and the compact wrote its number down, and the compact was wrong by everything it owns. Kin is whoever knows your song. I learned mine one night at a time at her shoulder, where I will stand until the water takes me. It is short, and it is rough, and it is hers.